Hello, I'm Joe Lloyd. I'll be the moderator for this session. Today, this session is Briget Powell is going to be speaking about some large language models. So just a reminder that this session is recorded. So at this point, I will go ahead and turn the presentation over to Briget.
Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for being here. I realize that this has been a pretty jam-packed couple of days, and I know quite a bit of this has been with information about AI. And I will also confess to having been watching Wicked when I was thinking of a title for my presentation. So you are not wrong if you were thinking about that. My name is Briget Powell. As Joe said, I am actually full-time for the University of Wisconsin, and I live in Champaign, Illinois. I work full-time remote. And my job title is officially integration coordinator, which I'm basically an air traffic controller. I work with systems in our Center for Teaching, Learning, and Mentoring. So my focus is on how to help our center do a better job of serving our faculty in the professional development realm. But my background is in distance education, online education. I started doing that my last 12 years on active duty with the Air Force. So I've been doing that for, golly, about 26 years now. So that's kind of how my affiliation with this organization came about. So what I wanted to do today is talk a little bit about the goods, the positives, and some of the negatives about AI. But I also wanted to give us some space, if it's needed or desired, to chat a little bit about questions that you might still have lingering from what you have heard about or have been talking about in some of the other presentations that you've seen today. So please feel free to ask questions. And again, I hope that this is a helpful presentation. And at the end, I do have a document that I'll share, and I'll share this presentation in the workshop area for that purpose. Anyway, so I mentioned what my role is, and that's kind of how I got interested in AI. We started hearing about it, and it was sort of this sky is falling and the house is falling, and why is this such a concern for everybody? And this was probably about 2 years ago, and I just really wanted to know what was the hype about it? Why were people so concerned? What was there to be concerned about? And so I started just playing with it. I have a colleague who is very much into it, and I just wanted to see what there was to it. And as I started dabbling or playing with it around the edges, I started to find that the things that I found useful with ChatGPT were not the things that I was hearing a lot of people talk about. Because I don't face the classroom, I face people who face people who face the classroom. I had a little bit of a different use case, but I wanted to pursue it because I felt that it was useful. So I throw this up here because clearly lesson number one out of this is that Copilot does not have a future in stand-up comedy. Although it's kind of funny for how bad it is, I did ask him to tell me a joke, and this was the result I got. Just for the benefit of the audio, I said, "Please tell me a joke," and Copilot said, "Why did AI go to school to improve its algorithms?" And I said, "That's horrible." And he said, "Well, how about this? Why did AI cross the road to optimize its pathfinding algorithms?" So clearly, joke telling is not his or its forte. And that's something that I try to be very mindful of in terms of how I approach my speaking about or speaking to or so forth with any kind of chat GPT function um, or tool is to deliberately keep it gender neutral, to refer to it as they, it, and so forth, because it's very tempting to refer to it as he or she or him or her. Um, and and I appreciate Matthew's comment about let's not laugh at it, that Copilot is a novice trying to learn. And that's kind of the flip side to what I was just saying about it's not a human, so I don't want to anthropomorphize it by giving it a his or her designation. But at the same time, yes, it is trying to learn. And so I came up with some particular items that I wanted to just sort of boil things down to. And they're here on the screen here. When I say that large language models are a subset of generative AI, I think that sometimes there's a confounding of the two terms, that people think generative AI is LLMs and vice versa. And in reality, large language models are a subset of generative AI. Generative AI is a much broader concept. And I think that's becoming better known now that it's becoming more ubiquitous. Things like the image generation capabilities of some of the tools, and some of the tools that are specific to image generation, some of the um, medical technology tools and so forth. So we're talking specifically here about those large language models. And I think, again, just to level the playing field, I think this has been something that folks have heard about and have been talking about. But the reason they're called large language models is because they basically vacuumed up what was on the internet, and that was how they were trained. So they trained based on the languages that were out there, the language that was out there, the vernacular, and so forth. Couple of other things I think that are very useful to understand. And again, I'm not trying to present this as me presenting something that is brand new and revolutionary, but I think they are things that, especially as we're ending this conference, this wonderful workshop, it's helpful to renew and refresh and remind that like any tool, it gets more useful the more often that that you use it. It's really just like any muscle or any skill. I love to make the cookie, the Madeleine, and I have the special pan and so forth. But I find that if I go for too long between making batches of it, I tend to forget the intricacies about how long to leave it in the oven and so forth. So like any tool gets more useful, like any youngster, it does require adult supervision, and like anything shiny and new, it needs to be approached carefully. And so lesson 2 is large language learning models, like the Wizard of Oz, may run amok if left unsupervised. So talking about the more you use it idea, and this kind of goes back to what I was mentioning when I started, is it's extraordinarily important that we have events like this and organizations like this and conversations where we talk about how do we use this in the classroom, and how do we I've got some great questions in the Q&A, one in particular from Zaina. How do you measure the impact of large language models on student learning outcomes and overall classroom dynamics? And I replied, honestly, that's a bit out of the scope of this particular presentation. It's a very important question. And I think it may also be a little early. I think that our evaluators and evaluation teams are, I don't want to say scrambling, but they're endeavoring to figure out how to answer those questions, or what questions to ask to answer those questions. Um, but of course, we're going to want to figure out what the return on investment is for using these technologies. So, but having these resources that are available to us and using them in a classroom facing way, we seem to have it, and I think this is a positive, we seem to have moved away from this intense fear that the only thing that students were going to be using ChatGPT and these other tools for was to plagiarize and to cheat. Not to say that that doesn't happen or that hasn't happened, but my sister is a high school teacher, and I have a good friend who is a college freshman rhetoric teacher. And both of them have essentially gone through that wave of that happening. And, it was a very steep learning curve, and it was very painful for some of their students who, didn't learn the lesson right away that, if you're going to use ChatGPT to write something for you, the least you better do is proofread it, because, it's not going to be perfect. But they're starting to understand this utility of the tool for the things that it can do versus the things that it can do well versus the things that it's problematic when it's used for. So, for example, instead of worrying about a student using it to plagiarize an assignment, I've heard strategies along the lines, and these are probably things that you've heard as well, but I've heard strategies along the lines of asking the tool, the ChatGPT LLM tool, to come up with an outline for a paper on the topic that you're writing, and then have the student go through the outline and make comments and turn that in, and have that be something that is the first step in the evaluation, and go through that process. So things where you're sort of co-opting the chat function, the chat GPT, and making it an ally as opposed to an opponent. But stepping back from the classroom piece of it and thinking back to what I was talking about in terms of the joke telling and how I found that I was using the tool. I mentioned at the beginning that I work with some different technologies and tools to better serve the population that I serve, the Center for Teaching, Learning, and Mentoring. And I particularly work with Salesforce, Eloqua, ClickUp, a couple of other different tools along those lines. And they're all different. They all do a lot. They all probably try to do more than is really useful, because you can't be all things to all people. But what I found is, if I go to Google and I search, how do I do XYZ, a Google search, ignoring the part now that you're getting about the generative AI as experimental, the Google search is going to give me a list of websites. And oftentimes it's going to give me prioritize the list of sites for whatever tool it is I'm asking for help for. And excuse me. And I find that if instead I go to Copilot and say, hey, can you help me figure out how to run this particular kind of report in Salesforce, or how do I create this particular type of task in ClickUp? and then I'll get a response. And if I still don't understand it, because, I'm not the biggest math person. So especially if it's an Excel formula or something like that, I'll say, okay, can you give this to me in a bulleted list? Um, can you write it at the level of a fifth grade student? So that's something that I don't have a lot of fear or anxiety around, because number one, I'm asking it for input that I'm going to validate or invalidate, as the case may be. And number two, it goes back to the idea that I can take it, I can proof it, I can reject it, or use it as I see fit. So it's not like I'm asking it for a citation about a particular event that I have to then go and potentially double check the citation. So, that's something that me as an employee performing my primary duties, and this can extend to instructors as well. I have had instructors that have said one of the things that they found was extremely helpful in the online environment was being able to have AI rewrite some of the prompts, not like prompts when we're talking about Gen AI or LLM prompts, but prompts for discussions in an online discussion board, or prompts for activities, to just not so much necessarily to clarify, but to offload some of the workload. So that kind of becomes that time saving piece, that load sharing or work sharing piece of it. So being able to, either in your own space or with fellow colleagues, being able to say, okay, what are different ways that we can collectively brainstorm, ways that individually we can make our lives, a little bit less in need of 27 hours a day, and find ways to offload some of these routinized or routinizable tasks or activities that are not going to incur a demonstrable harm on our students. And in fact, looking at it in what I feel is the right way to look at it, is it frees up time for us to then, as instructors, devote that time to face our students or communicate with the students in an online environment. One of the things that I tried to always communicate when I was teaching online and teaching instructors who would teach online is that if you're teaching in a space where you have the opportunity to have any face-to-face time, it really behooved you to treat that face-to-face time as precious. If you had face-to-face classroom time, that was not a time, ideally, and this is not meant to be critical of anybody, but this was my philosophy. That time is not a time to do lectures or readings or things that could effectively or successfully be done outside the classroom. That was a time for lab work or group discussion and so forth. Similarly, what are those things that a chat GPT AI tool can help you as an instructor do, so that you are then freeing up time that you can use to again put that effort into either self-care, which I know is a hushed term that we're not supposed to whisper around administrators, but really is something we should be focused a lot more on, I think, especially folks that are student facing. So those are those kinds of things. It's also things that can be helpful for us to communicate to students as individuals. One of the pieces that I've included in the resource document that I've compiled, I asked, rather shamelessly, a lot of the resources I put together, I asked for AI's help. I'm doing a presentation on how AI can benefit instructors and students alike in ways that are not related to directly classroom. And, what would you suggest? And chat gave me some great ideas. But one of the things I asked is, what are some of the key skills that students should be, people who are students now should be working to develop as they're facing a world that is going to be more and more AI adjacent or encountering AI. And those are the kinds of things that data literacy, analytical thinking, those kinds of things. I know that there's been a lot of conversation in a lot of the sessions about prompt engineering. I think a lot of English teachers would say, yeah, that's just good grammar. It does go a little bit further than that, but being able to write a query that gets you to the answer in one or two or three revisions versus having to continue to write and write and write to be able to get to the core of what it is you're trying to find out. So, so what are those things that and again, I'm talking about sort of extracurricular, but classroom adjacent. What are those kinds of things that can benefit a student? I read a headline. I didn't read the whole article, but it was talking about I think it may have been a private school that was had started using AIs for tutoring and had seen a fairly dramatic increase in standardized test scores. Those are the kinds of things. And let me stop here for just a second, because I don't want to come across either like I am personally or professionally advocating for electing ChatGPT as Pope or King or whatever. That's not what this is intended. And I think that I talk about this on my next slide. Very much the adults need to stay in charge. And so I think, yeah. So for professional development, similar kinds of things. What are those tasks or activities in the realm of faculty professional development or individual professional development that, and this kind of goes back to asking ChatGPT or the tool, hey, can you help me figure out how to do something that I don't know how to do? I have 2 Boston Terriers, so if you see things running back and forth behind me, it's not giant rats, it's my dogs. But help me do something that I don't know how to do already, without necessarily having to take a course or do a deeper dive into writing reading an entire manual. Give me the synopsis of kind of thing. So lesson 3, and this is circling back to the idea of the more you use it, compare your first encounter with a smart device, smartphone, smartwatch to now. You're a lot more familiar with it. You're a lot more comfortable with it. It's kind of the same thing with Gen AI, and especially these large language models. A ways down the yellow brick road, if you'll forgive the, it's going to feel a lot more natural, a lot more comfortable, and I think that's a good thing to aim for. But along the same lines, we need to avoid the temptation to equate technology with maturity or validity. And I think this is, as Matthew was saying, avoiding, we have to be kind to the LLMs because they are trying to learn. But at the same time, it does require that adult supervision. And I think this is probably the single most important thing, or the important element of interacting with or working with Chat GPT and LLMs, and that is that there always has to be an adult in the room, and conversely, Chat GPT and the LLM will never be the adult in the room. Excuse me. And what I mean by that is the trust but verify. And I think that sometimes there can be a temptation, and some people can attach malfeasance or ill intent to an LLM. Well, they're just programmed to lie about this person or lie about that person or XYZ and so forth. But because they are learning, and they're learning based on the input that they have, they're going to output as quickly as they can what it is that they think you want. And so it's not a matter of necessarily having to comb through in minute detail everything that the output gives you, especially if as in the examples that I've given, if it's something that you're asking it to help guide you, or hey, create a packing list for me for a trip to the Loire Valley for 3 weeks in summer, something like that, you're going to review anyway. But if it's something a little bit more significant, or more along the lines of, help me write a thesis or, a research question or so forth, yeah, you're going to want to dive a little bit deeper into it, because that's got deeper repercussions and more significant issues associated with it if it's not vetted correctly, if the resources are not looked at appropriately. And then, and that's kind of the second point on my slide, be extra skeptical when approaching queries around fact-based topics, and similarly check grammar and spelling. And I think that it's also important to point out that there's still the issue of large language learning models have learned on the data that's available out there. And so it is biased. There is a dearth of, am I saying that right? A dearth of literature and information on the interwebs that has been generated from ethnic minorities, LGBTQ, all of these other population. No, I've got to be really careful. All of these, there are a large number of underrepresented populations that have not been, that are not well represented, because the method used to train these large language models, there's nothing with which to train them. So that's another thing to be cognizant of. I have to believe, although I'm not aware of and haven't, and this is a shortfall of mine and I need to correct it, I haven't done any research on whether there's a lot of work being done to correct that. I have to believe that there is, but I don't know. So lesson 4, like a toddler, the desire to please often overwhelms the focus on accuracy. So a glimmer of Glinda, the talked a lot about things that are complicated or difficult, or things that you need to be aware of or watch out for or so forth. But what is ChatGPT and the like good for? And I've talked a little bit about these things throughout the conversation, but I just wanted to highlight a couple of them here. Things like sounding boards. If you are needing to, let's say, write a letter to a city zoning council because you need to request an easement for planting, I don't know, but something along those lines. AI might be a way to help you write that. If you want to write a funny poem for somebody's birthday, those kinds of things. And again, I'm mentioning them only because I don't know that we all think about that component of what these models can do for us. Starting points. This one, both academically and work related for me personally. Sometimes if I've got a task for work where I've got to write let's say I have to write a flow plan for a particular tool or process, sometimes I just don't know where to start. And even with the idea in mind that I can start in the middle, I don't have to start at the beginning, it can be difficult. And so going to ChatGPT and saying, hey, can you give me the elements I need to include in a change management plan for getting an organization to adopt ChatGPT, which is one of the things I used. I had to come up with a plan to get our organization to adopt it, and I had no idea where to start, even though, and I Googled it, and there were 10,400,000,000 examples out there of change management plans, but asking ChatGPT to give me an example, or Copilot, excuse me, specifically for ClickUp. I think I may have said ChatGPT, I meant ClickUp, but asking that question gave me a contextualized starting off point to be able to then modify, fill in the gaps, change things. And the beauty of something like that is because I asked Copilot as my starting point, if I had taken something that I had found on an internet or a website, I would have to execute due diligence around the idea of proprietariness or potentially copyright. And it's not saying that you don't have to do that at all ever with LLMs, but the way that the information is presented in a query that of the type that I just described is there's less of a likelihood. So it's just something to keep in mind. Sanity checks. If you are trying to find, I swear I saw a movie that had this kind of a character and it was this year or so. And I mean, that sounds kind of trivial, but it can be a quick way just to ask a goofy question, or, like a sidekick. If you're stressing out, if you're having a mental health moment, or you have a student that's having a mental health moment, it can be a distractor. I'm not saying that it replaces anything having to do with mental health treatment or counselors or anything like that, but in a moment where somebody is having a particularly challenging time, it can be a way to say, hey, why don't you have a quick conversation with ChatGPT about what's going on, and it can potentially help simmer things down a little bit. So I've got a final takeaway here. Gen AI and all of its capabilities, including LLM, should be respected but not feared. Like the great and powerful Oz, if you pull back the curtain, it demystifies the situation. And if you use the liberal wand of good judgment and common sense, help sort the hype and the hyperbole from genuine value and validity that you can get from from what is available. So I have a resource document here. I'm going to click on it and open it. When you click on it, it will invite you to make a copy. But I just want to, since I've left a couple minutes, I just want to sort of give you a quick breeze through of what is included here. And essentially, I've got some presentation resources as well as a list of resources, as I mentioned, that Copilot gave me. And then also I had a question from Tara about what about universities building their own LLM for campus specific use? Would I recommend this? So first question I asked, Copilot was, can you give me a list of universities that have their own LLMs? And that's what you see in the first part there. I knew about University of Michigan having their tool UMGPT. The reason that didn't appear on the top list about custom LLMs is that Michigan's is actually a Gen AI suite. And this goes back to the beginning where I was talking about the generative AI large language models are a subset of Gen AI writ large. So what Michigan has is actually bigger and broader than simply an LLM. And as you can see, there's 4 other organizations that have a similar kind of tool. And then what I was mentioning about critical thinking skills for thriving in an AI-driven future, they're there as well. So I'm going to also put this in the chat, just because I know that even though I'm going to put it in the resources section, it may not be something that everybody remembers to go. And if it's useful, great, and if not, otherwise. So like I said at the beginning of the presentation, I wanted to leave some time to let folks talk about or ask or share about anything else that was going on. Also wanted to, if folks needed a little bit of a longer break to empty their head out or what have you. As I said, I know it's the last formal presentation block of the conference, and I know how that gets. So with that, I will open it up to any questions if any folks have any. I think we might be able to, there's a Q&A block I know in Whova, but I think the chat might work as well. So either way.
Yeah, either of those work. Thank you for the presentation. That was awesome. I know in my case, one of the things I taught a course a couple of semesters ago for teachers that were learning to teach math. And so one of the things that I'd always start the class with was just an opening project or an opening problem, because it was required for the course to take attendance. So I just showed them, I said, when I was teaching in my elementary classroom, this is what I would do during attendance, just to kind of model it. And before one of the classes, I asked ChatGPT, given this topic, create a question, a math problem that you can give to students. Well, it gave me the problem and I looked at it and I'm like, that doesn't seem quite right. So I asked it, what's the answer to this problem? And it said, there's no way to answer this problem the way that it's written. I said, but you created the problem. And it said, sorry, sometimes I make mistakes.
Oh.
Like, wow. So we had a conversation in class about that. We said exactly what you just said, is that it's a fantastic tool, especially when it comes to teaching. You can help, it can help with lesson plans and things, but you still need to be smarter than the tool. And I mean, I noticed that as a teacher looking at it, hey, there's something not quite right about that problem. But if you didn't know any better and then you tried to give that problem to your students, it would be very frustrating for them because there's not possible to answer it. So,
Right, exactly. Yeah. And I know there was a um, fairly well-known case where, and this was an article in the Wall Street Journal, I think a year and a half ago now, and I cannot remember, there's a name for the dilemma that a person is given where they can choose to say an awful word out loud and they'll save a million people, or they cannot say the word and a million people will die. And the chat GPT's response was, well, you shouldn't say the word because the word is really offensive. And so it was, it was that value judgment piece of it. It was illustrating, and again, this was a couple of years ago now, but that was illustrating this idea that, well, value judgments are not something that ChatGPT or those kinds of tools are going to be very fluent with. So, um,
Would it be okay if I go ahead and ask rather than put it in the chat, Bridget?
absolutely.
Awesome. So I really, something struck me. I think it was kind of the contrast of you saying, being like the adult in the room, so to speak, as opposed to, hearing, my research was just focusing on the student voice. Another research was focusing on the student voice in the panel as well. Um, and you said, I feel like there's almost a tension, between these two things because I think the truth of the matter is that even though, we're early adopters, we're working in online learning technology, um, a lot of faculty are still scared and administrators are scared. So sometimes the answer to that is, just to put the fist down and, just say, can't use it, at all. Do you think that there's an opportunity to navigate both the adult in the room while also honoring the student voice? And how do you think that might look?
Yeah, I absolutely do. And I'm so glad you asked that question because I think the answer is that you want to create what I think of as willing co-conspirators of your students. And you bring them along for the adventure, kind of like what Joseph was talking about with the math problem and then talking about it with his students, is instead of him just dealing with it behind the scenes with ChatGPT, he showed it to the students and he was like, look at this, this is hilarious, blah, blah, blah. And had a chance to discuss it with his students. I think that, and I think that this is unfortunately a fear element that a lot of faculty have, is that they fear terribly looking vulnerable or not looking like the sage on the stage, to their students, which is so sad because I think those of us that are here at a workshop like this are kind of the flip side of that, where it's like, no, I don't want to be vulnerable in front of my students to the point where I'm crying in a puddle at their feet, but I want them to know that, hey, I'm learning. I'm learning along with you, and so why don't you come along on this learning journey with me? And it's a balance, and it's it's what's the word I'm looking for? It's iterative. It's going to change. You're going to change how you do it each semester based on what you learned from the semester before. But golly day, if you just think about how much excitement you can generate from your students if they're thinking about, hey, I actually get to participate participate in creating, not just creating my own learning, but helping my teacher, instructor, professor shape the course of how, they're not changing the learning objectives or anything like that. They're helping to shape the course of how I go about achieving what I need to know.
Absolutely. And I love co-conspirators too. Co-collaboration is one thing, but co-conspirators sounds mischievous, so I love it.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, and Matthew put in the, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Losing face is the #1 issue faculty express when adopting technology. Yeah, and that's one of the, I mean, I don't know how you go about having a university or college-wide makerspace at the beginning of a semester, maybe where you just get a great big gymnasium or whatever, and you create all of these different, like laboratory settings where faculty and students all get together and they play with all the different technologies or whatever, and it's a fun thing, and people screw up together and they laugh about screwing up, and then they show up in the classroom a couple days later and they're like, hey, you're that person who couldn't figure out how to hit pause on whatever. So but yeah, it's true but sad, sad but true.
Absolutely. I know in my case, again, when I taught elementary school before coming to higher ed, I was absolutely with my students, I don't know everything. And if there's some questions that you may ask, and if I don't know, okay, well, let's figure out the answer together. And so I'll teach you because for one, I'm not going to be sitting next to you your entire life. So my job as a teacher is to not just spout knowledge at you, because especially now we have the entirety of the internet in our pockets at all time. If you just want facts, you can find it in 5 seconds. But my job is to teach you how to think and how to do these things and figure them out on yourself. And especially since I taught math and science, I mean, that's the whole scientific method and process, is coming up with a question, and then based on that question, how would we answer it, and go through that whole process. So even teaching little kids, I would be the same thing, and they would find it their mission to try to stump me on things. And I'm like, look, I
Yeah.
don't know everything, but I can help you and I can show you how to, find the answers, because that will help you your whole life. I'm not going to be standing next to you the whole time. So
Yeah. My favorite strategy. So my last 12 years on active duty, I taught a course that was for officers from the grade of 04 to 08, if you're familiar with military rank. It doesn't really matter, but the grade or the rank structure could become very challenging depending on personality and so forth. But one of my favorite strategies, if somebody asked me a question that I didn't know the answer to, I would say, that's a really good question, Joe. What do you think about that? And so I just popcorn it over to another student. But another thing that I was very conscientious about doing is I never asked somebody a question. I never said, so what is the longitude of a hippopotamus's nose, Joe? I always prefaced it with a name, because I couldn't guarantee if that person wasn't just, having a moment where they were planning their dinner menu or something like that. So it's kind of a side note, not really relevant, but so yeah. And I like that comment. Next time we see each other, we'll be peers in the chat. So.
and you say that, but that doesn't always work. I know in my case, like when I was student teaching and then substitute teaching before I got a full-time job, I went back to the schools that I went to, and I would substitute teach, and with teachers that I had when I was in school, and they're like, we're colleagues now. You don't have to call me Mr. So-and-so or whatever. I'm like, no, that doesn't work. I know it's been, 10 years since I've been in your classroom, but no.
I feel that. Yeah.
So. All right. Well, thank you everybody for this presentation and for joining us. We do have our at 3:50. We'll be back in the main room for the reflections and wrap up of this workshop. But thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Briget, for this presentation, and I'll see you all in the closing session here in just a minute.
Thank you, everyone. Appreciate everything.